If you think you're smart, you're already in trouble. Not because you're wrong, but because you've stopped checking, stopped questioning, stopped thinking. Smart people, the ones who always have an answer, always know the next step, always speak with certainty, are the most dangerous minds in the room. Not because they're loud, but because they're asleep, and no one dares wake them. Welcome to Mind of Musk. If you came here looking for entertainment, you're in the wrong universe. This isn't where we cheer. This is where we tear apart illusions, even the ones that look like compliments. Especially those, because the most paralyzing illusion on Earth is the praise for being smart. It starts early. A kid gives the right answer, gets applause. Another kid asks too many questions. He gets silence, or worse, a warning. I know. I was that kid. I kept asking. Why? How? Why again? Not to be annoying, but because nothing ever made complete sense. And when something doesn't make sense, you don't nod. You drill. But people hate that. They hated it then. They hate it now. Because questions ruin comfort. Questions strip away identity. Questions don't let you pretend. When I was 9, I asked why teachers wouldn't let us challenge the textbook. The answer I got was silence, then punishment. That's when I realized being smart isn't about what you know. It's about what you obey. Schools reward obedience dressed up as intelligence. They call it being gifted. But real intelligence has nothing to do with remembering. It has everything to do with unlearning. Most people never unlearn. They accumulate knowledge like it's currency, never once checking the value. They live inside systems designed by people long dead, follow beliefs they've never examined, chase goals they never questioned. They are praised for fitting in, not for figuring things out. And once you're smart enough to win inside a broken system, you'll never want to break it. That's the curse. When you think you're smart, you stop being curious. You defend your knowledge instead of challenging it. You stop asking stupid questions. But here's the problem. The world is built on stupid questions. Every breakthrough you admire came from someone who asked what others were too smart to ask. What if this is wrong? What if everyone else is lying? What if I've misunderstood everything? These are not smart questions. They are dangerous ones. That's why no one asks them. Not in boardrooms, not in universities, not even in science. Because people don't want to find truth. They want to be right. They want to sound correct. They want the applause. They fear the silence that follows a question no one can answer. But that silence, that's the edge of reality. That's where the real thinkers live. The ones who are willing to sound dumb, willing to get laughed at, willing to throw a rock at the glass box everyone else calls logic. I've been there. Often. I don't care if I look stupid. I care if something's real. When I asked why rockets cost hundreds of millions, people looked at me like I was a child. But a child is the only person who would dare to ask that. Adults nod. Adults assume. Adults defend the cost. I reject it. And that rejection begins with a question that sounds dumb. Why is this normal? Ask that question often enough, and you'll find out. It never was. It was just protected by people who needed it to stay normal. That's how the world works. It's built on convenient lies, defended by smart people. The dumber you sound, the closer you get to something true. But you have to be willing to go there, to ask what others are too trained, too praised, too afraid to ask. Why do we live like this? Why do we believe this? Why do we never stop to look again? The curse of smart people is that they've stopped looking. They're not thinking. They're running a program. Efficient, impressive, but dead. You want to wake up? Then kill the need to sound smart. Burn the script. Risk the silence. Ask the dumb question. It might be the only real one left. The smartest question I ever asked sounded stupid. Why can't rockets be reused? People laughed. Not because they knew the answer, but because they assumed there was one. That's how stupidity works in modern systems. It's not the question that's stupid. It's the reflex to dismiss it. Because deep down, no one's actually thought about it. They're just echoing what came before. That's the danger. A stupid question forces you to stop parroting. It makes you go first principle. Not, what does the industry do? But, what must be true for this to make sense? That's not comfortable. It's not popular. But it's necessary. Without stupid questions, nothing real begins. Because every system protects itself with a wall of assumed logic. And the only thing that can break that wall is a childlike question. One that sounds dumb. One that pauses the meeting. One that makes people look at each other and realize they've never actually asked it. In every major breakthrough I've seen, whether in tech, business, or life, there's always a moment where someone dares to be that idiot. The one who asks, why do we do it like this? Not to be edgy. Not to play devil's advocate, but because they genuinely don't understand, and that lack of understanding is pure, clean, untouched by politics, ego, or tradition. Most people don't ask those questions because they're afraid of sounding dumb, afraid of looking like they don't belong. But here's the truth. The person who asks the stupid question is usually the only one in the room who's actually thinking. Everyone else is just performing, repeating, defending. That's not intelligence. That's mimicry. And mimicry builds nothing new. The world doesn't move because of perfect answers. It moves because someone asked the wrong question at the right time. So, I ask them. Constantly. Because when something doesn't make sense to me, I don't assume I'm dumb. I assume the system is lazy. And if I keep pulling at that thread, I'll find the flaw. I'll find the hidden rule. I'll find the thing everyone is protecting without realizing it. And once you find that, once you find the invisible assumption holding up the illusion, then you can tear it down. That's how SpaceX happened. That's how Tesla happened. That's how every company I built happened. It never started with a bold vision. It started with a dumb question. Then came the silence. Then the resistance. Then the shift. That's the power. Not the question itself, but the courage to ask it. Over and over, even when no one claps. Even when they roll their eyes, even when they tell you, that's a waste of time. Maybe, or maybe, it's the key they didn't want you to touch. Because once you do, you'll never see the system the same again. You'll never be able to go back. That's the point. That's the door. And it only opens for the ones who sound dumb enough to knock. Reality doesn't care how clever you sound. It doesn't reward big words. It doesn't pause to admire your TED Talk voice. It just moves, relentlessly, brutally, based on physics, on inputs and outputs. Not feelings, not performance. That's why most people fail silently. They follow rules that were never tested. They speak in structures that sound intelligent but collapse under pressure. They optimize for sounding right, not for being right. And then they wonder why nothing works, because they've never built anything real, only arguments. But I don't build arguments. I build rockets. And rockets don't care if you quote Einstein. They care if you understand force, mass, heat, and failure. They care if you debug, if you get your hands dirty, if you shut up and fix the problem. That's reality. And it exposes everyone who's hiding behind language. When I ask someone to explain something, I don't care how smart they sound. I care if it works. I care if they can teach it like they've seen it break. If they've lived inside the failure, not just studied the theory. Because real intelligence isn't about memorizing, it's about surviving. And survival demands clarity, not complexity. The more someone tries to sound smart, the more I assume they're bluffing. Because truth is simple. It doesn't need decoration. It just needs proof. Gravity doesn't negotiate. Neither does entropy. Neither does bankruptcy. These are not social concepts. They don't care how respected you are. They don't care what school you went to. They only care whether your system holds under pressure. Most don't. Most systems today are like porcelain. Pretty, polished, fragile. One wrong assumption, and they explode. One untested idea, and they vanish. Because people forgot that reality isn't built on consensus. It's built on consequences. You don't win by sounding correct. You win by being right, and being right without applause. That's hard. It's lonely, because the world rewards performance, not results. People would rather praise a polished liar than listen to an awkward truth. But the awkward truth is what I want. Always. Even if it breaks everything. Especially if it breaks everything. That's why I ask the question no one wants to hear. Does it actually work? Strip away the theory, strip away the buzzwords, strip away the PR, and just ask, does it hold when things go wrong? Because that's the test. Not whether it sounds good in a presentation, but whether it survives. If it can't survive failure, it was never real. And that applies to everything. Business, science, relationships, education. If it collapses under pressure, it was fake to begin with. That's how I think. That's how I build. That's why most things don't impress me. I don't care how great something looks when it's safe. I care how it behaves when it's collapsing. Because that is the truth. Not the pitch. Not the plan. Not the brand. The behavior under chaos. That's where reality lives. That's where your ideas go to die, or to prove themselves. And if your idea can't survive in the real world, then it doesn't matter how smart you sound. You've lost. Because reality doesn't care. It never did. And it never will. If reality doesn't care how smart you sound, then why does everyone work so hard to sound smart? Because they're not performing for reality. They're performing for the system. A system that doesn't reward thinking. It rewards compliance. From the moment you're born, you're trained to obey. Not to ask, not to question. Just follow. Say the right thing. Do the expected thing. Sit still. Memorize. Regurgitate. Pass. And if you do it well enough, they call you intelligent. But what they really mean is you're manageable, predictable, safe. That's what the system wants, not curiosity. Curiosity breaks things. It disrupts the routine. It questions the teacher. It challenges the boss. It rewrites the code. And systems hate that. They are designed to suppress noise, not explore it. That's why schools punish kids who think sideways. That's why companies ignore people who see differently. That's why families shame the child who asks why everything feels fake. Because in every institution, curiosity is a threat, and threats get silenced, not with violence, but with grades, with HR reports, with raised eyebrows and cold stares. That's how the system teaches you to stop looking. You get penalized for asking the wrong thing, not because it's wrong, but because it's dangerous. Dangerous to order, dangerous to comfort, dangerous to the illusion that everything is fine. I've lived that. I've felt the pressure to play along, but I never could. I couldn't pretend a test score meant I understood something. I couldn't sit through a lecture that ignored reality. So I asked, over and over. And every time I did, the room got quieter. Not because people were thinking, but because they were scared. Scared of what might happen if we stopped pretending. If we admitted we didn't know. If we said out loud that the emperor had no clothes. Because once you say that, you can't unsee it. You can't go back. You can't play the game anymore. And most people aren't ready for that. They'd rather protect the system, even if it's broken, than face a world without it. Because that world requires something terrifying. Independent thought. That's what curiosity leads to. And independent thought can't be managed. It can't be timed. It doesn't fit in a spreadsheet. It won't wait for approval. That's why systems fear it. That's why they punish it. That's why we build entire lives around silencing it. But curiosity doesn't die. It just hides. It shows up in late-night anxiety, in the feeling that something's off, in the silent doubt you feel when everything looks fine, but feels hollow. That's curiosity trying to speak, trying to wake you up. But we're trained to ignore it, to drown it in dopamine and distraction, to call it overthinking. But it's not overthinking. It's under-truth. It's the mind begging for a glimpse of what's real. And if you ignore that too long, you lose something critical. You lose the ability to see, not with your eyes, but with your judgment. You stop knowing what's real, what's noise, what's yours. You become a performer in someone else's system. And the longer you perform, the harder it is to remember you ever had a mind of your own. That's the real cost. Not bad grades, not low salary, but the death of perception, the decay of curiosity, the quiet extinction of thought. And by the time you realize it's gone, it's already too late for most. But not for you. Not if you're still asking. Not if you're still searching. Because as long as you're curious, you're not fully lost. You're just waking up. And that's where real thought begins. In the friction. In the discomfort. In the moment the system says, don't ask. And you ask anyway. If the system punishes curiosity, then the smartest move is to hide your curiosity until it's too late for them to stop you. That's what I do. I pretend not to know. I ask dumb questions. On purpose. Not to be cute. Not to play dumb. But to break through the performance. Because when you act like you don't know, you give people a chance to reveal whether they actually do. Most don't. They're just repeating what they heard. So when I ask someone to explain a system, I don't want jargon. I want clarity. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it deeply. If you can't break it down like you're talking to a child, then you're probably just repeating lines. That's how I test people. Not with exams. With ignorance, I show them my blank page. Then I wait to see if they fill it with truth or theater. Because most people can't resist the urge to sound smart. So they throw words at you. Buzzwords, frameworks, fancy phrases. But none of it survives pressure. None of it helps a rocket launch. None of it solves real problems. That's why I don't hide my ignorance. I use it. I lean into it. I ask the questions that make people pause, that force them to slow down, that strip away the show. Questions like, but why? What happens if that part fails? Have you seen it break before? And most of the time, the answers reveal everything. You'll see who's honest, who's thinking, who's bluffing, who's protecting their ego. Because truth doesn't hide behind complexity. It shines through it. But only if you're willing to ask. Only if you're willing to say, I don't know. Show me. That's how I learned engineering. Not by pretending. By exposing my ignorance and letting people correct me. And if they couldn't, if they got frustrated or confused or defensive, then I knew they didn't understand it either. Ignorance is a spotlight. It exposes liars. It humbles experts. It simplifies chaos. And when used correctly, it becomes a weapon. Not a weapon to attack, but a weapon to reveal. To cut through systems built on pride and repetition. That's how I redesign factories. I ask every engineer, why do we do this step? And if they say, that's how it's always been, I challenge it. I don't care if it's tradition. I care if it works. And half the time, we find out it doesn't. That's how progress happens. Not by upgrading answers, but by downgrading assumptions. By asking the questions that sound dumb until the truth comes out. Questions that open a crack. That crack opens a gap. And that gap becomes a new way of thinking. You don't get that by sounding smart. You get it by being real. And being real starts with admitting what you don't know. I do it every day. In every meeting, I'll stop the smartest person in the room and say, explain it to me like I'm 5. And if they can't, then no one really understands it. That's the rule. You don't know something until you can teach it. You don't own it until you've felt it break. That's why I keep asking. That's why I stay stupid on purpose. Because every time I admit I don't know, I get closer to what's real. And every time someone pretends they do, they move further away. That's the difference. One leads to insight. The other leads to illusion. You get to choose which one you serve. The smartest people I've ever met didn't sound smart. Not at first. They sounded crazy, unpolished, awkward, too blunt, too slow, too intense, too honest, Because real intelligence doesn't speak for applause. It speaks for clarity, for truth. And truth doesn't care about presentation. It just wants out. That's why the real thinkers, the ones who actually move the world, are so often misunderstood. Because they don't fit the script. They don't say what you expect. They pause too long. They ask weird questions. They don't laugh when you do. They're not trying to impress. They're trying to see. And that makes people nervous. Because when someone stops performing, they become unpredictable. And unpredictability breaks systems. So we label it. We call it weird, difficult, unstable, delusional. Not because it is, but because we don't know what else to do with it. And once we call it crazy, we don't have to listen. We get to dismiss it. We get to win by default. Until it works. Until that weird idea becomes a company. Until that strange question becomes a product. Until that awkward silence becomes a breakthrough. And then suddenly, everyone says they saw it coming. But they didn't, because they weren't listening. They were waiting to be entertained. Real intelligence is quiet, inconvenient. It gets laughed at before it gets quoted. And by the time it gets recognized, the thinker has already moved on. That's why I don't care if people think I'm crazy. I expect it. I count on it. Because if no one's laughing, I'm probably not far enough ahead. The ones who sound smart, they're optimized for now. The ones who sound crazy, they're building what comes next. But it takes pain, rejection, isolation. It takes years of hearing "that's stupid" before you hear "that changed everything." That's the price, and most people won't pay it, because the reward isn't guaranteed. The pain is. But I don't care. Because I'm not chasing validation. I'm chasing reality. And reality never comes from consensus. It comes from conflict, from friction, from the willingness to be wrong in public for years. That's what intelligence is. Not the ability to say the right thing, but the courage to say the real thing. Even if it gets you mocked, especially if it gets you mocked. Because that's the signal. When people flinch, when they laugh too loud, when they change the subject, that's when you know you've hit something real. And once you hit it, don't stop. Dig. Stand your ground. Sound crazy. Sound wrong. Sound alone. But keep going. Because in the end, they don't remember who sounded right. They remember who was right. And that changes everything. You weren't supposed to understand this perfectly. You were supposed to feel something shift, a discomfort, a silence, a crack in the way you think. That's where real intelligence begins. Not with answers, but with better questions. If any part of this made you pause, if it made you reconsider what you've been told is smart, then don't stop here. Because this isn't just a video, it's a wake-up sequence, and you're only on the first layer. Subscribe to Mind of Musk, not for entertainment, but for the kind of thinking that doesn't get applause, only results.